lots to talk about today. I'll start with something that I normally don't talk about in my path to full transparency of no part of myself that I would not turn over. There is something else, but I don't think it's right for the video, but maybe I'll do it one day. But this one is impulsive thoughts. So actually there's more attached to this as well. So when I tell the story of my life to people, I say that I had depression. Now, I know that the reason that I started using that term was for multiple reasons. One of the reasons was similar to what I was saying the other time I did this confession-y style video, which is that it gives me to other people a sense of struggle that then elevates my position to speak on certain things. So in that sense, you could see it in a similar vein as before as being a lie. Now, it's important, I think, to establish the context around it, which is that I definitely struggled with mental health very, very badly for a while. I think it was earlier than I even at the time gave it consideration. I think now what I use is 19 to 24, which I think is the most accurate. But I think it really took a nosedive around like 21 after a particularly abusive relationship to me. A short relationship, but a very meaningful one. Not necessarily always for my betterment, but like impactful and meaningful. Where I felt like I was abused. And after that, I think things were much more difficult for me mentally. But I think that it had started, the groundwork of it had started earlier, from the isolation from my friends and arguing with my family and things at work, or the work that I was doing and my future and just everything, I think, built to this feeling of very, very intense apathy and anxiety that I then projected onto certain emotions. It's like projection mapping of a 2D image to make it look like it's 3D. I think I projected my anxiety and the different flavors of it as emotions, and then I acted in that way. When in reality, just as minor aside, whenever the camera goes off and I can't see myself talking anymore, feels very, very different. Feels very, very different. And it feels easier when I see myself, so I'm going to turn myself back on, which is why I keep leaning forward and tapping the screen. For some reason, it feels easier to talk about it when I can see myself talking about it, so I'm going to keep doing that. But maybe that's something to think about as well at some point. In any case, and I did get therapy, but not very long, only a few sessions, as far as I remember now. And we didn't really get far into anything, to be honest. It didn't really, I don't think I really clicked with the person that my therapist. And then I started just working on myself, and I felt really, really confident. Even in my worst moments, I felt very, very confident that I was going to I was going to live how I wanted to be perceived, regardless of how I felt. I was going to act like the person that I wanted to be, even if at no point in my life I ever felt like that person. I just couldn't sort of stomach not being that way, like not being perceived as that person, at least, even if I didn't see myself as that person. So I was never like diagnosed, I think is the sort of the point of this. I was never diagnosed with depression. I never had like clinical depression. But from everything I know, the way I've talked about it, people I've spoken to, and empathize with, and what I know now in hindsight, and how my life felt then and how it feels now, I would say that the word depression feels very accurate to what I was going through then. And it's an incomparable life that I have now to what I had before. And so I feel not like an authority on depression, but at least an authority on my own journey and path. And it's led me to be able to empathize with a lot of people who are going through similar things or are dealing with similar things, or at least in part have aspects of it that they can relate to, or I can recognize in other people. And so it doesn't feel like a lie, though I know that the reason that I started using it was because I wanted people to feel the weight and the gravity of what I felt like I went through. And it felt like the only word that could carry that. And now I think it's accurate. But that just felt important to talk about. And I think one of the aspects that I don't think I've talked about very much to many people about what I went through at the time. That was one of the things that was probably the most difficult, were the intrusive thoughts. So when it was at its sort of worst moments, but it was quite sustained. I remember if I wasn't having intrusive thoughts and thinking about them actively in the moment of having them, I was thinking about having them. Like they took up so much of the capacity and the space of my mind. I almost had intrusive thoughts about the idea of having intrusive thoughts. Like I just couldn't get out of my head that if they weren't there, that they were coming. Or I almost like brought them into being by being so obsessed with the idea that they were coming, or they were there, or they might happen, and what they were doing to me, and how to deal with it and how to process it. Like it was a constant battle, just endlessly tiring. And they were extremely violent or self-destructive or outwardly destructive. They were sort of, very, very horrible, and very, very constant. At work, with friends, on the street, by myself, didn't really matter. It was worse when I was going through something difficult or boring, even. If someone was doing something to me or causing me to feel something or think something, that would flare it up. But really, it could be anywhere. It could be anywhere, anytime, anything. Walking down I remember vividly walking down the street, nothing happening at all, and just having them pop into my mind constantly, and thinking to myself, I don't know how I'm going to deal with this all the time for the rest of my life. And just being sort of battered by it, not being able to, and because it's thinking, you can't think about other things because you're thinking about that. So you can really only think about, you can either have the thought that it's putting in, or you can think about the thought. It's very, very difficult to also like concurrently have another thought about something else. So you've got to find and steal moments or time where you can process other things, and think about other things. And it feels like you're lying and cheating to everyone around you, because you can want to be enjoying someone's company and your mind is thinking something incredibly violent about it. And so you feel like you know what you want and you know what you feel, but your mind is injecting this thing that also feels like you. And if you attach a sense of yourself to it, you're an insanely horrible and masochistic, and sadistic, individual who has like terrible values and wants and desires and is a piece of shit, basically. And it's very hard not to insert yourself into it because you're in the image. It's you projecting yourself onto a situation. So you have to disconnect from the generation of it and become separate from it, even though it's your imagination, your mind, your projection, you in it, and you thinking about it, and it's welling from a true place. It's just that the projection is not real. So it's very difficult to disconnect, and that, I think, it was really, really, it was actually, I would say, debilitating at work. There were times where I would be sitting in a meeting and I couldn't concentrate at all. I couldn't focus on what was being said, or I had to pick pieces as it was happening. Or it's like when you're reading a book and also watching a movie at the same time. But the movie's super interesting, but you're really trying to read the book. But the movie's like really catchy and jumpy and like loud, and there's like ba 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 ba, people shooting someone. You're like, oh, I really want to watch this movie, but I really have to read this book. It's like it was like that. So you just constantly feel not like you're operating, and also you're beating yourself up the whole time for being awful or whatever. And that was pretty constant, and I hated it, honestly. To be blunt, I really couldn't stand it. It made me very upset. Mostly just because it got in the way. Like the imagery really, really didn't bother me. It bothered me, but I knew it wasn't. I very quickly dissociated from it. So I even started creating a hierarchy of how bad the images were, and I could replace them. So if I had one that was sexually violent, I could just be like, well, that's pretty bad. So let me just replace it with something that's just violent. Let me just imagine killing my boss in a certain way while I'm trying to listen to them talk. And you just have cycles of like different ways you're killing, and it's just this insane. It's just this crazy coping mechanism that I had to come up with in order to, just to live, really, whatever sort of semblance of existence I was living at that time. And I don't think many people realize how constant and what I was going through then, and how difficult it was to just be and think and act as myself in that moment. And then I also remember, I don't really remember them going away, but I remember I remember realizing that I hadn't had that, and was like, oh shit, I feel very clear. I haven't had, oh my gosh, yeah, why, I don't have this anymore. What the hell? When did that go away? I just didn't notice the transition. That's the crazy thing about it, is that its onset can be so insidious and so background and so dissociated that when it goes away, for me at least, I almost forgot that my normal state before was any different. I think it's really important to hold on to the memory of what normal used to be, to know what I have now. And when I've slipped, I remember particularly when I ended things with Emmanuel, poorly, if I might add, myself. I did not handle that situation very well whatsoever. The next day, I remember the other thing I wanted to talk about. The next day, I had intrusive thoughts again. And I was like, whoa, this sucks, man. I was like, but I was almost just impressed with the fact that I got through. I was like, how on earth did I cope with it, manage this for so long? It was crazy. I had one day of it, and I was like, oh my goodness, I can't get over this. It was really just kind of enlightening, strangely. And I was able to empathize with myself from a perspective I hadn't had before, which was it's a funky position to be in. And and then I went through a phase of like trying to sort of make them happen, to see if they were still there. I don't know, like sometimes I'll poke test. It's like if you have a wound and you're like, how bad does this hurt? Like, how bad is this? Or you have like a toothache and you sort of poke at it. And it's like a bit satisfying, but you know that you're not doing permanent damage, so it's fine. You just like poke at it a little bit just to see how bad it is. It's kind of like that, but poke testing, I like anxieties and stuff. You get that sort of like initial wave and then it goes away. And sometimes I'll like really try and hone in on the wave and see if I can pull it up and see if I can still root out where the anxiety is coming from. And nowadays it just doesn't, there's just nothing to hold on to. So there's nothing for me to uproot, or nothing at least that I'm consciously able to uproot. And I started doing that with the intrusive thoughts, but it doesn't really work like that. It doesn't really work like that. You're just then projecting a thought that you're then dispelling. So it's like, okay, it's not the same thing. The other thing that feels misleading that I think I'd like to stop doing is when I talk about myself and my worst moments, I also talk about suicide and suicidal ideation. That's why I paused. Suicide and suicidal ideation. And I mention, I do it in kind of an off-cuff way where I mention that, my worst moments, I'm considering, but I won't say it explicitly, but I'll allude to it. Again, I think it adds gravity to like what I was going through. And it is true that I did have suicidal thoughts, but they felt on a similar level to the intrusive thoughts, where I would project myself walking in front of a car or something, or just ending my life. But they never felt real, and they never felt like things I would do. So even when I had intrusive thoughts about violence, I was never like, I want to stab this person in the face. Gosh, it's difficult because I so want to do that. And I'm so drawn to doing that. It was just putting myself in that position and that sort of just like running ahead to its conclusion, or to what it looks like, and that playing in my head. And so I had that with suicide, where I would play it through sometimes. And that was most stark for me, again, after breaking things off with Emmanuel. And I think I was most upset at myself on how I'd handled things. And I knew I'd done it poorly, but I just had this like complete shutting off moment. Like I felt the day after, actually it wasn't the day after, it was like minutes as it was happening, where I just felt this complete switch, this shutting off of everything as a defense mechanism in that moment for something I hadn't had to process for a while, like ending a romantic engagement with somebody, and just everything around it was a bit silly. But I felt this switching off of this version of me that I'd built, and regressing in some ways to this other version of me. And I remember walking home, crossing, I remember this very, very, very vividly, exactly where I was. I remember crossing the street outside my flat and looking at the cars, and just there my mind would go to like walking in front of the cars and killing myself. But I would never do it. Like I knew even in that moment, I was like, this is a projected thought, but all it's showing me is I have no feeling towards this. If my life ended, I wouldn't feel anything about that. I don't feel anything about that fork of potential futures in my life, or if that happened, for example. Which I guess is part of the overwhelming apathy that my mental state sort of took on. And that's scary in itself, honestly. I would say perhaps as terrifying, but then I wouldn't know. And terrifying is the wrong word, because I wasn't feeling anything. But it's very, very complicated. There's a lot to go into if we want to unpack why that's the case. And I've broken down many times thinking about it. But yeah, and so talking about it as if I were ever on the verge of committing suicide feels disingenuous. It feels like a lie. I don't think I was ever actually close to doing that, though I did think about it. I think that's an important distinction to make. Yeah. Okay. Gosh, this is already 20 minutes, and that was quite heavy already, and lots of other things I wanted to talk about. You know what? I'm feeling I'm into it right now, so I'd like to do it. I'm going to keep going. I've got an unlabeled. No, I don't want to talk about that. Not objective. Wants, focus on wants and flow from there. Yeah. Yeah. I don't really remember where I was going with that, and I don't really talk about that either. Seeing a photo and triggering a feeling of being observed and judged. Yeah, it was actually the further away I get from my own image and thinking about myself and how I'm perceived by others, the more uncomfortable. And now I'm starting to realize, I realized this earlier actually when I was thinking this and I was writing this down, that this relates to a conversation I've had with Ed many times where I haven't really been able to understand where he's coming from, of the discomfort of being perceived. But the more that I've disconnected from perceiving myself as someone who is observed by others, the more uncomfortable it is when other people drag me into that and objectify me, but not even in a way where they're objectifying me, because that's kind of entering my realm of self-viewing. It's like I saw a photo of myself and it triggered in me the idea that I looked like that to someone when they were looking at me, and that then created an image in their head of me looking like that. And I looked at myself like that, and I was like, oh, that's weird. That's not how I saw myself or see myself or imagine myself. Because I guess in that moment, or looking back at it, I wasn't imagining myself at all. I was fully in the moment, being the universe. And it almost like crushed me into a box in that moment and forced me to see through their eyes myself in that box state rather than in the infinite state. I don't know if this makes any sense to anyone, but it might make sense to Ed. And so, yeah, it made me uncomfortable. And I was like, wow, what a moment. I'd love to, I enjoy not feeling observed. That's a very poor conclusion to that, but the rest of what I said was more important. The hedonic treadmill and the wonder of nothing. Wow, I really can be quite funny when I write. The hedonic treadmill is just, I was reading up more, or researching a bit more about Epicurus. What a G. What a fantastic guy with a fantastic philosophy. Love it. And the mention of the hedonic treadmill of like the more you have, the more you want. When you gain something that is what's it called? Shit, I've forgotten the words. When you gain pleasure, but the pleasure is not static pleasure, it's not contentment, it's not joy, you acclimate, and therefore you need more. It's not a permanent state. You're not adding to a permanence or a general state. And I think if you go in the reverse, I call it the wonder of nothing. If you go in the reverse and you value only things that are static, that bring you peace, it brings you down to a moment where you can appreciate in much, much greater amounts the tiniest of things. Because when you're on the treadmill gets faster and faster and faster and faster and faster and faster. And so the small things lose value. If you have 1,000 cars then walking. This is a very silly example. Maybe walking is not the right one. Then like the wonder of cars as an invention, for example, has no meaning whatsoever, because you're already like 10 leagues past that into like the most incredible version of that thing. So you can't even appreciate the thing itself necessarily. Again, just pinch of salt, please. You understand what I mean, even if I'm not saying the words exactly right. But if you remove yourself from that treadmill, or you walk very slowly, or you're standing still, I suppose, then you can appreciate all of it for what it is. You can appreciate the Lamborghini in all of its parts, those that are destructive and those that are not. And you can also appreciate the most basic of car, and you can also appreciate the horse and carriage, and you can also appreciate walking, and you can also appreciate standing still. Like you gain access to the appreciation of the entire scale, because you are able to look around you. You don't have to just keep looking forwards. And so the entire world just becomes more meaningful and more beautiful, and brings itself that pleasure that you were seeking from the next thing. You get from everything. You from sleeping in a tent, you can be like, wow, sleeping bags are so warm, and the fact that I'm even like not that cold right now, that's so cool. Maybe I'm not as comfortable as I would be in like a 4-star hotel, but how great to be this close to nature and listen to that and be connected to, whatever it is. But then it's like, oh man, I don't even have a tent. Well, hammocks, like they're actually surprisingly comfortable. Isn't it amazing how you can put these up anywhere, and I can be in the middle of nature when I want to be? And it's just like, it gives you this complete shift in perspective where you start to just piece together this infinite wonderment of the smaller things, because you have the space and time and perspective to see them, when otherwise you couldn't. If I was always on the hunt, yeah, you get it. I was going to use a bad analogy, but I think I've already made my point. Okay, I'll go back to the non-objective wants. I think that what you want is just far too complicated to go into. But what I need to go and do when I'm talking to people, I think I already do it, but I think maybe more, I need to focus on this more, is appreciate that what I have already done is understand, and I need to do more, is understand what it is that I want. This is going to sound so basic with it, and there's something in here, but I don't think I've got it all unkinked yet. So I will actually not talk about it. Scratch that. Sorry, it's just not where my brain is flowing right now. And perhaps the last thing for today is ego and betterment. I consider myself to be different to how I was before. And I think that because of what I value, the definition of the word better, which I think I would actually is a word I would want to try and get away from, whether I'm better or worse, I am closer aligned to the values that I have always wanted to live by and exist on. I consider that a position, I am brought a lot of joy from the position that I'm in now and the person that I am now versus the person that I am before. I was living in misery before and in suffering before, and now not so much. I'd like to untangle that from any sense of ego that I have that I am better than I was before. Because if I think of myself as better than I was before, that word carries baggage for when I meet or engage with somebody who is maybe closer to the state that I was before. And I think of myself as better than them. And now I know that feels like there's a jump there. It feels like there's a semantic jump between me self-improving and me being better than everyone else. But I think it's easy to get tangled. And I think that this one is an easy one to untangle from, in that I don't think that I am a better person than somebody who's going through something very, very difficult, because there's underlying values that sit beneath that could very well that I might see in them that I value very, very highly, and respect very, very highly as well. But it just brings this sense of, well, if they don't share my values, or they don't have values in line with the ones that I have now formed that I want to live by, do I think I'm better than them? Am I better than somebody who is extremely materialistic? Am I better than them? What does that mean? By what metric am I better? And I think what it feels like people do, or at least I did, is I apply my metric of what I think would be better for me. What makes me better? Well, for me, generally, it's trying to unattach from things from the perspective of others, materialism, industries that are exploitative, whatever. I think that makes my life better than it was before, for me, on the values that I have chosen for myself. That's the full chain. And so when I consider myself better than someone else, I'm judging them based on my chain, so my values. When if I were judging them based on their values, then they might be better than me. If, I don't know, taking a topical point here, if Elon Musk if his values truly were to try and become, super, super wealthy or whatever it is, focus on that and power and all that kind of stuff, he's better than me in that regard. And so what even is this word? What even is being better? Like, morally superior? But then I would have to place my morality above the morality of other people, which if I am doing, I am in some senses objectifying a sense of morality, which would be fine. But I don't think that I believe in an objective morality. I think I believe maybe in a general morality. I believe that there are widespread accepted general moral positions that most humans hold, that if you align to them, you start to feel some sense of alignment and peace too. And there is a point of tension at some point for most people where that scale of peace tensions off against the things they would have to unattach from and untangle from in their life, and it becomes not worth it to do so for them by their judgment. A lot of people just don't think about it. Some people just happily fall into that space. Some people don't have to think about it and kind of feel it out and get there. Some people should think about it and live a life constantly in tension with it. I would suspect that most people in the modern day that I've interacted with feel the discordance but don't explore it, or don't know how to explore it, or don't know what that might look like, or even if they do know what it looks like in practice, they don't know what it looks like in principle. People being like, I really should be on social media less and I should really disconnect. And I'm like, yeah. And when you ask them why, they're like, oh, well, it's really bad. Like, it's bad for my attention. Like, I'm like, not okay. You have to start from the value. You start from the value that's driving your position, and you will end up deciding that you should quit social media if that's the conclusion. But there are loads of things along the way. There's loads of little steps along the way. A way earlier step will just be like not assuming personal value from the perspective of others, or not living for the perspective of others, not thinking that you have to be a certain way in order to appease a certain group or crowd or whatever, because that gives you value. Like, just taking that value into your own hands is a much, much earlier step. Now, I would say that getting rid of social media is akin to changing your environment, where it can help you to get there. But if you were to do the deeper value-based development that I was saying, and you do that thinking, you will start to challenge and question your place in the social landscape, I think. And you might conclude that you just need to change your relationship with social media. And maybe it just needs to be a little bit different. Maybe you'll conclude that actually you can use it exactly the same amount that you were before, but now with a refreshed perspective that isn't as damaging to you. Great, fantastic. If you can do that, then that's wonderful. Because it's whatever works for you. It's not about the action. I particularly can get very sucked into it. I think most people live in that camp. And so not having it helps me avoid parts of myself that are damaging, regardless of my perspective on it, because it's a really addictive thing. Being a heroin addict, just don't have heroin in the house. It's a good step. It doesn't solve your addiction, obviously. That takes a lot of years of self-control and practice and therapy and whatever to change your value system, to like really build like a relationship with yourself where you don't take it anymore. But it's probably extremely helpful not to have heroin around as well to make that happen. So it's just that kind of thing, right? You've got to understand what the behaviors are for. Not having heroin isn't just so you don't take it. It fundamentally is like attached to the value that you're driving and the person you want to be. And so tackling people's wants at that point, I think, is where the conversation needs to happen. You know, talking to people and being like, what do you want? Who do you want to be? What do you want? Really? And I think what happens whenever I have that conversation is you find that what people want is very similar. And what people want is is the same thing that I want, which is why I think I project so often onto those people that like, shit, maybe it's not completely off base to think that I'm better in these areas because it's what they want, but they aren't, for lots of reasons, able to do it. But I think that's also very unhelpful. I would like to untangle my own ego from the sense of development, because I was like, well, why would I be doing this if I didn't think I was becoming better? Like, I obviously think that there's some betterment factor, otherwise I wouldn't be doing any of this development, right? But I think that's wrong. I think the usage of the term is a misdirect. I think I'm just becoming more aligned to the values that I hold, and I will stop at some point that feels like what I would have to sacrifice in order to keep pushing to those values isn't enough. My values need to adapt, or I have reached saturation of my values. I think full saturation of values tends to look very ascetic, like a monk or something. And I doubt that I'm going to be a monk ever. But living a simple life, detached from industry and big society most of the time, in a simple life surrounded by friends and family, and actually having to live and be active in order to give myself my base Maslow hierarchy needs, food, water, shelter, relationships, I think is pretty close to an ascetic life, honestly, just without the abstinence. And probably still with some dose of going to cities and appreciating the modern creations and stuff, maybe. But I don't know what exactly that balance looks like. Well, what a journey, huh? What a trip that was. Cool. I think I enjoy this more. I think I enjoy the idea of these really honing away from what I'm doing day to day and my travels, and being about me and about my mind and my mindset. And my experiences being my own, and letting it shape my thoughts and my actions and my feelings in the moment, and completely separating it from any sense of needing to be for anyone else. And these are the moments that feel most for me when I talk about myself so freely and openly. And so, yeah. I think I'm ill. My throat kind of it feels a bit like sicky, and my nose is a little bit blocked. My voice is a little bit off, and I have a little bit of a headache and some eye strain. So that's great. But that felt very cathartic. Gosh, I've got so many words that I'm now avoiding. Good, bad, right, wrong, like, dislike, better, worse. Anything exceptionally binary and subjective that then projects generally. Golly. What a lot of untangling to do. And then I'll probably rant about categories one day, but not today. Okay. Good night.